Welcome to the 9th webinar in this monster series. Today we're going to be talking about the art of feedback. How do you provide feedback in a way that actually works and works for the individual? So that's the topic for today, and I'm just going to switch over and add in my PowerPoint. And for those of you who doesn't have your microphone muted, please do so. Please do so. Thank you. So what feedback is really about giving people what they need. And again, I can hear one of you who don't have your microphone muted. Please mute your microphone so we get the background noises away. Thank you very much. And that's why I call it the art of giving feedback. There are many different ways, there are many different formulas for how to give feedback, but there are also some core considerations, and we actually started on that already yesterday, because it is about giving people what they need. So let's first define what is feedback. And this is again where something we have done, we feed back to the person who did it about the results. And the reason we do it is to improve or continue or change the behaviors next time. So we can give it to an individual, we can give it to a group, team feedback, whatever. But the main thing is that it is about achieving results, and either for praise or for correction, change, improvement, right? And this is where it becomes interesting. Because if you remember what we talked about yesterday, for those of you who were present, we talked about the fact that people have different needs for feedback and how feedback is provided. So I'm just going to again go back to the slide from yesterday, a slightly adapted version. And this is where we once more, and I know I keep going back to this, and some of you might say, do we have to go back to these intrinsic motives all the time? And the answer is yes, because they're so crucial for understanding other people. So the motive we talked about yesterday was social acceptance, and I'm just going to briefly remind you about some of the highlights. When people have a strong need for social acceptance, they are very self-critical. They want things to be perfect. And they also have a contextual confidence that has to be built. So if you're not careful, you can then hurt that process, damage the process. At the other end of the scale, in this case in the blue end here, we have people who have so much confidence that they don't really need feedback because they do believe already that everything they do is perfect. They just do it and it's right. And if there is a mistake, if there is something I do wrong, just tell me so I can correct and move on. And you can even be very direct. Now, in itself, that sounds easy to manage, but it is not, because it's so easy to understand that people with a strong need for social acceptance need more frequent feedback. We'll get back to those. What can be more difficult is actually people who don't need it, the people with a very weak need, people who do not need frequent feedback, because they might be believing that they're going in the right direction even when they're not. And they might even also have to express their own opinions about which direction they're going in. So you will then have to convince them also. But the good thing is you can be very direct. If they happen to be the boss, though, there is a problem, because they don't need the feedback. So why do other people need the feedback? That doesn't make sense. And here comes the challenge, because at the people with a strong need, they do need it. And it doesn't matter what the need the boss has. So what is the conclusion here? The conclusion is you have to look at the receiver, not yourself. And I hear it over and over and over again in trainings, in recruiting situations, headhunting situations. I'm not getting enough feedback from my boss. So generally speaking, no matter how many trainings we give on the art of feedback, we have to understand that feedback is very much driven from one's own need. If I don't need it so much, I don't have to give it so much to you. And here comes the problem when the receiver needs it a lot more than the giver does. Going back to the people with a strong need for social acceptance, they will have a high need for frequent feedback, meaning you have to do it more often. And you also have to be delivering the feedback with consideration. You cannot just go in and start blaming or criticizing, because that will not be a way where you will get through to them. So first of all, you have to think about, how can I do it? How do I deliver my feedback? And you got to take their emotions into consideration. And this is where, if you have something that wasn't so good that you have to correct, start off with a self-evaluation. We're going to come back to the self-evaluation part in a moment, and we're going to talk how it's related to the competence level. However, if you have people where you know they have a strong need for social acceptance, use the self-evaluation tool anyway. Now, one thing you have to be aware of as well, if you're praising people with a strong need for social acceptance, they need that, they like that. It is really nice fuel on their engine, so to speak, but they might start questioning whether you mean it. So you have to be very serious about the way you deliver it, and you have to be meaning it. It has to come from the heart, and it has to be clear. So how do we then deliver the feedback? Well, there are many ways, and some of the method described, I remember the first one I was introduced to was called the burger method or something like that, or the sandwich, and it's really not deep enough. It doesn't give you what you need, because feedback is much more than just saying a few things about what could be done or different. It is about discovery. It is about analyzing. It is about having plenty of options and solutions and committing to action. And it is about constantly then following up and evaluate on the improvements or the progress, whatever thing you're giving feedback on. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you through this cycle, and I'm going to explain to you what happens in each and every step of this model. So first of all, we have to have the person who's receiving the feedback to go into what we call self-discovery, or discovery at least. And self-discovery is when the person knows that something wasn't going the way it was supposed to. It could actually also be when it did, so it doesn't have to be negative. Just make sure that you understand that feedback is also on positive things. In this case here, I just written in the opposite way. But sometimes they don't know what made it. So your job is to have them go in there and find out what happened. Again, it could be good, it could be bad. I basically find that more people also in meetings spend much more time looking at what went wrong than what went well. And there is a saying that what you focus on is what you get. So it's important also to do the discovery on when something did go really well. When you have somebody who is not really aware, this could be due to a lower competence level, so they don't really understand the process so well. Then we can do what is called assisted discovery. Normally, I'm not an advocate for leading questions, but here you can help by using your question technique to actually get them on the right track to find out what was going on. So what happened? What went on? And again, remember, it can be good or bad. So whatever went on, and again, the less they know, the more you help them, but you still want them in their brain to be the one connecting. It is not about you telling. And this is where this process deviates from most other feedback processes, because most feedback processes are focused on the boss or whoever it is, the mentor, the coach, just telling. This is about having the person in front of you do their own little journey into the feedback. It is so much easier for you to create the buy-in on what has to come later. Now, the next step is that you have to then go in and say, okay, what caused it? So what was the reasons? And we can go again in both directions. Let's presuppose that you have somebody who did something really well. And often we will just go praise and say, good job. However, if you want them to continue doing the good job, and perhaps even do even better, then you might ask, so what was different? What did you do different this time than last time? and then wait for them. Be patient. Even if you know the answer to the question, be patient, because you want them to discover their own story. Now, then the next question is, and when you did that, what did that trigger? Now, as you can see on the illustration here, the last one of the mopeds is the one actually hitting and scratching the car. But the reason is the first moped, not the last one. And this is again where typically there's a whole chain of reactions. And if we're not aware of that, but we just look at the end and say, well, there was a moped falling onto my car and it scratched my car. Well, maybe that moped was parked correctly, everything was great, but the first one was not. So we have to make sure that we look at the whole chain in there. And again, I'm just repeating and reminding you, it doesn't matter whether it's good or bad what you're giving feedback on. You still learn from the process, and feedback should be about learning. It's not just about telling, it's about learning. How can we do even better next time? Now, once we understand what caused it and what is the consequences of that, then we can move on. But again, remember, it is not you telling. And I'm going to repeat this probably a few more times today, so bear with me for that. But I just want to really get that into your brain, that it's not about you telling. It's about you asking great questions so that you can have people discover their own issues. Now, once you have passed this, then we go into the next phase. This is about creating options and solutions. And again here, what do I see people typically go wrong on? Well, they take the first and the best solution. So they don't look for more than one option. One of my mentors always said, there's always at least 3 different options, 3 different solutions. And I think that's a good reminder, because if you think about it that way, then you have to force yourself to find them. Because if we need a solution, okay, we have a solution, okay, do we have any alternatives? Well, not really. Then you're not forcing your brain to find them. So here again, using the insisting question technique. So what other options could there be? Once you have at least 3, then you can start looking at which solution will be the best one. So when they are not familiar with the task, when they have a low level of competence, and competence is relevant when we're talking about feedback, because of course, the more competent people are, the better they will be able to do this discovery, because they probably already know where things went well and where things didn't go well. So if they have absolutely no idea, no clue on how to proceed, what other things to do, then you can chip in with your suggestions. But wait, give them the opportunity first, work with them, because this is again part of the learning process. And it is, as the leader, your responsibility to use every opportunity you have to teach your people, because that's what it's all about, being a good leader. It is the teacher. So make sure that you have at least 3 options, and then you discuss which one would be the better one. Now, I want to share an example with you from a training I did, and it wasn't a strategy training, but I asked them to come up with 3 different ideas on how to approach the future. Now, there was 5 groups, 4 of them did as told, and the 5th one, after the time given, said, and I asked, how many solutions do you have? They said, we only have 1. Now, the task was to have minimum 3. So I said to them, well, while the others will take a break, you guys have to come up with at least 1 more, because you need it for the next step of the process, because otherwise they couldn't really join the next steps of the process in the training. And they're like, oh, do we have to? And I said, yes, you have to, because that was the whole idea with this exercise, was for you to come up with multiple solutions. So I sent the rest off to coffee break, And these guys were going in there, and I was even kind enough. So when they said, we have one more, I said, okay, take a 5-minute break. So they also got the coffee. I am, after all, a nice guy. I know some people don't believe it, but I am. But in this case, we then started continuing working with it and starting working with choosing the right solution. And then I was debriefing after that part, and this group said, you know what, it's amazing, because the first solution we had took us an hour, and then you forced us to find another one, which we spent roughly 10 minutes on. And it turned out it was a much better solution. It was much more efficient, generated much more revenue, so much better solution. And it was only because I forced them. So initially I could be seen as a tough guy, forcing people to use their brain to think more creative. But at the end of the day, it's because not always is the best solution. And this is particularly in operational environments where I happen to do a lot of trainings. I see that as the go-to method. We pick the first and the best, and that is why we end up doing so much firefighting. Because we do something very quick to solve something and move on. We're kind of impatient, and then we just do. But we didn't really think well enough. So it's also your opportunity to work with people to teach them how to reflect, how to analyze a situation more thoroughly. So be firm on this and be careful you don't give in to your own impatience. That's really super important on this one. Now, once you have chosen which solution are we gonna pursue, then you have to commit to action. And this is where you make sure that it's very clear and you're aligned on your expectations. So what has to happen, by who, by when, what are the outcomes we're expecting? It is super important that you're aligned on this. Because if you make it too fluffy, nobody will really know what to follow up on. So again here, be patient. Make sure you got all the elements. So, okay, so next week, by the same time, what has happened and what have you done to this and what kind of results can I expect? And then when people have said it, it's also here where they start buying into their own solution, because you need buy-in to this. Because again, so many times, and I've seen this over and over and over again, and I'm sure a lot of you have experienced the same thing. You go into a meeting and then you discuss what should have been done, what should have been delivered. And then you have the usual people saying, well, I'm sorry, I didn't have time to do it, but I'll do it next week. And then you come back next week and like, yeah, well, there was this pressing matter and so on and so forth. We also have people who are highly stimulated by deadlines who procrastinate until the very last moment, not because they're lazy, because typically they're super busy doing other things as well, but because generally speaking, their whole rhythm is pushing things towards the deadline, making things in the very last moment, which often jeopardizes the quality. So again, here, there's a learning process in each and every step that we do when we're doing this cycles of feedback. And then we get to the last step, and that is evaluating the performance improvement. So we need to agree how often should we follow up? What should we look at and how often? And this is where we're now going to close the loop to where I started, because the frequency will depend on multiple factors. Part of it is the competence level. If you think about competence, and we haven't talked so much about competence yet, and then probably we should do one of the webinars about competence, but when you have people who are new on a task, and it doesn't matter what else they are doing and what other things they're experts on, but when they're new on a task, they need more frequent feedback. Because you want to make sure that they develop as fast and as efficient as possible. And if you leave people alone too much, they're going to be doing what they're doing if they happen to have a low need, so a blue need for social acceptance, because again, they believe in themselves and trial and error is great, so I just move on. And if you leave them too long, they may be moving on too far in the wrong direction. thus making unnecessary mistakes in the learning process. It doesn't hurt them personally, but the results and the outcome could hurt the organization, because again, at the end of the day, we need to be efficient. That is the whole thing. On the other hand, you may have people who have a strong need for social acceptance, and if they have any doubts, if they think I potentially could make a mistake, they're going to sit and wait for you. So it could seem like procrastination. In reality, it's just waiting for you to give them the feedback whether they are on the right track so they can move on without making mistakes. Now again, as competence increases, you can lower the frequency of these feedbacks. However, if people are still having a strong need for social acceptance, you cannot do that because they still need the feedback. It is part of building the contextual self-confidence. And this is where you can be so efficient, because we can do that. We can build them. A lot of people think the way we talk about the social acceptance motive that, but people who have a strong need for social acceptance can't be successful because, it's a tough life. And yes, it can be a tough life because they're very hard on themselves. They are very critical on their own performances. But we also know that they can be some of the most successful employees because they deliver a consistent quality result, and we need that. So again, there is no right or wrong, there is no good or bad. It doesn't matter what end of the scale. Everybody can perform. It's just a matter of how we perform, and this is what you have to be aware of. But, and again, I cannot say this enough, I promised I would remind you. So remember, it is not your need for feedback that should determine the frequency. It is the receiving end. Now, what is a good way to figure this out if you don't have access to the actual profiling tool? This is where I should do a little commercial for the locked profile, but I won't. You could ask the person. So when you're doing in the step before here, when you're committing to action, ask them, how often should we follow up? What would you like? What do you need? When do you need it? Do you need it every week? Do you need it every 2 weeks? Do you need it every 4 weeks? So have an open talk and discussion about it. This is a very, very efficient method. And unfortunately, I see too many people just telling, okay, let's meet next week or whatever. Ask the people, when do you need the feedback on this so that you feel comfortable moving on to the next step. So all in all, simple steps, but you keep repeating them. And that's why it's called the feedback cycle, because it doesn't stop here, then it starts over. So next time you then go into the same process. Okay, what has happened? And what caused that? And what were the consequences of what happened? And again, remember, it can be good or bad. It doesn't have to be on the negative only. So what caused it? What was the consequences? And then moving on to the next step, what are the various options for moving on to next level? And again, then you pick the right solution, but as much as you can, allow them to pick. And of course, as you progress here, this is also how you build competence. So this is very much the trainer role when you're providing feedback. Now, there is one more thing that you've got to take into consideration. And that is that people who have, we can talk for some of you, I know you're into also something called thinking structures or meta programs. You can also think about the internal external reference. And that is not the same as the social acceptance motive, but it is kind of similar. It has some similar traits. But if people have a very external reference, they need feedback to move on. They need your input to move on in the learning process. If people do not have that, if they have what we call an internal reference, that's when people have their own standards on the inside. They know when they're right, at least they think so. They may not be so open to the feedback, in which case you have to trick them. So you have to find out who are the ones they respect. Now, hopefully, if you're the manager, it is you who they respect, but it may not be, because you may not be the technical expert, in which case you should team them up with somebody that they respect for the technical knowledge on that particular subject. and then they will ask themselves for feedback on it. So you arrange it, you become the facilitator for the feedback. It is a way of cheating the system, so to speak. So very important aspect as well to remember. So all in all, summing up here, feedback is essential for everyone. Some people will not ask for it. Some people will not listen so much. We can go into many other motives. People with a high degree of autonomy do believe that their way is the right way. And if they are on the wrong track, they are very hard to convince about going in a different direction. I have worked with, I remember particularly one professional athlete who was very, very strong on the need for autonomy, and he kept overtraining. And his technical trainers said to him, "You're training too hard. We can see that when we monitor you." I was working with him, but his intrinsic need was so strong that he didn't listen. So he kept training, and even when he started getting injuries, his method for getting over them was to train even harder, to the point where he ruined his immune system and started contracting long-term diseases, which then ended his career. Yeah, it sucks because he was a really nice guy. He was strong as a horse, but he just couldn't take in the feedback. He couldn't take in the advice. And this is what you have to deal with sometimes, and you have to find your ways around it. So again, one of the ways to trick the system is to ask, who would you respect as somebody who could be your advisor? And then listen to who it is, and do not be offended if they don't pick you, because maybe you are not the right person. Maybe they need somebody with an even higher skill level. So just accept that and then move on. Now, this ended today's session on the feedback cyclist, also known as the art of feedback. And I do recommend you spend a little bit more time on it than just giving them the sandwich method, because it really doesn't move much. We have tomorrow, we're going to dive into the brain, and we're going to talk about the brain structures that create these assumptions, which we know lead to a lot of misunderstandings and conflicts. So that's going to be tomorrow's topic. How come we make assumptions? How does the brain function? Why does it do assumptions? How does it help us? Because it does. And how can we overcome them? And then next week we have virtual leadership, overcoming team differences, and self-leadership. Now there are 2 slots open for next week. So if you do have any topics, I'm inviting you to send me an email on contact@psq-international.com. And I will be more than happy to look at it so that we can fill in the 2 slots on Tuesday and Thursday. So for those of you who just wanted the content, thank you for hanging in here once more. For those of you who have questions, stay tuned. We're just going to kill the recording here and open up for the microphones.